seconds.
Okay. Hello again. This is Miss Jody, and I'm with Literacy Volunteers, but it might find me somewhere else. But I want you to, the other day I read a story about Peter Rabbit, and they were written by Beatrix Potter over 100 years ago, and she wrote a lot of stories about funny little tiny animals. So Peter can sit here and listen to me. Well, today I'm going to talk about his cousin Benjamin, who had a family, and they were called the Flopsy Bunnies. So this is Benjamin's family. So we're going to say, it has all kinds of big words, and I'll try to explain them. It is said that I don't think that's the first page. Let me make sure I have the first page. It is. It is said that the effect of eating too much lettuce is soporific. Now that means it makes them very sleepy. I have never felt sleepy after eating lettuce, but then I'm not a rabbit. They certainly had a very soporific effect upon the Flopsy bunnies. So Benjamin Bunny, remember he's Peter's cousin. When Benjamin Bunny grew up, he married his cousin Flopsy. They had a very large family, and they were very improvident and cheerful. That means they didn't have a lot of money, but they were very happy. I do not remember the separate names of their children. They were generally called the Flopsy Bunnies. As there were not always quite enough to eat, Benjamin used to borrow cabbages from Flopsy's brother Peter Rabbit, who kept a nursery garden. Sometimes Peter Rabbit had no cabbages to spare. Okay. When this happened, the Flopsy Bunnies were across the field to a rubbish heap in the ditch outside of Mr. McGregor's garden. You remember we met Mr. Gregor with Peter? So they have a big garden with vegetables. Mr. McGregor's rubbish heap was a mixture. There were jam pots, paper bags, and mountains of chopped grass from the mowing machine, which was always very tight, tasted very oily, because you can imagine you mow it, it gets the oil in the grass. That wouldn't taste good. And some rotten vegetable marrows, which is a type of potato, and an old boot or two. One day, oh joy, there were a quantity of overgrown lettuces which had flowers. You know when lettuce grows up, it has a little flower on it? Well, that's what they were in the heap. The Flopsy Bunnies simply stuffed lettuces. By degrees, one after another, they became overcome with slumber. Remember, they were soporific? And they lay down in the mown grass. Benjamin was not so much overcome as his children. Before going to sleep, he was sufficiently wide awake to put a paper bag over his head to keep off the flies. The little Flopsy Bunnies slept delightfully in the warm sun. From the lawn behind the garden came the distant clickety-clackety of the mowing machine. The blue bottles, that's a kind of bug, a fly, and they're called the blue bottles. The blue bottles buzzed around the wall, and a little old mouse picked over the rubbish among the jam pots. I can tell you her name. She was called Thomasina Tittlemouse, and we'll read about her. She's a wood mouse with a very long tail. She rustled about the paper bag and awakened Benjamin Bunny. The mouse apologized profusely and said that she knew Peter Rabbit. See, you know her, don't you? While she and Benjamin were talking, close under the wall, they heard a heavy tread upon their heads, and suddenly Mr. Gregory emptied out a sack full of lawn mowings right on the top of the sleeping Flopsy Bunnies. Benjamin shrank down and hid under his paper bag. The mouse, Thomasina, hid in a jam pot. The little rabbits smiled sweetly in their sleep under the shower of grass. They did not awake because the lettuces had been so soporific, remember, made them sleepy. They dreamed that their mother Flopsy was tucking them in a hay bed. Mr. Gregory looked down after emptying his sack. He saw some funny little brown tips of ears sticking up through the lawn mowings. He stared at them for a long time. See, he saw the very tips of their ears. Ah. Presently, a fly settled on one of the ears, and it moved. Mr. McGregor climbed down in the rubbish heap. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little rabbits, said he, dropping them into his sack. The Flopsy Bunnies dreamt that their mother was turning them over in bed. They stirred a little in their sleep, but they did not wake up. Mr. McGregor tied up the sack and left it on the wall. He went to put away the mowing machine. While he was gone, Mrs. Flopsy Bunny, who had remained at home, came across the field. She looked suspiciously at that sack and wondered what everybody was. Then the mouse came out. That's the same mouse. Came out of her jam pot, and Benjamin took the paper bag off his head, and they told this very sad tale. Benjamin and Flopsy were in despair. They could not untie the string. Remember, he tied the bag in a string? Mrs. Tittlemouse was resourceful. She nibbled a hole in the bottom of the sack. Then the little rabbits were pulled out and pinched to wake up, because they were sound asleep. Their painters stuffed the empty sack with the rotten vegetables, an old blocking bush, and 2 destroyed turnips. You remember, they were in a junk pile, so there was not very nice stuff, but they filled the sack. Then they all hid under a bush and watched for Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor came back, picked up the sack, and carried it off. He didn't know it was empty, did he? He carried it hanging down as if it were very heavy. The Flopsy Bunny followed at a safe distance. How about that? You were scared of Mr. Robert, weren't you? Okay. They watched him go into his house, and then they crept up and into a window to listen. Mr. McGregor threw down the sack on the stone floor in a way that would have certainly been extremely painful to the bunnies if they had happened to still be in there. They could hear him drag a chair on the flag floor and chuckle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little rabbits, said Mr. McGregor. Hey, what's that? What have you got there, spoiling now? Inquired Mrs. McGregor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little rabbits, repeated Mr. McGregor, counting on his fingers. 1, 2, 3. Don't be silly. What do you mean, you silly old man? In the sack, he said. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little rabbits. The youngest Flopsy Bunny got up from the windowsill. Mrs. McGregor took hold of the sack and felt it. She felt it could hold 6 rabbits, but they must be very old rabbits because they were so hard and all different shapes. Not fit to eat, she said, but the skins will do fine to line my own cloak. She was going to skin those little rabbits. Line your cloak, shouted Mr. McGregor. I shall sell them and buy myself some baccy. To rabbit tobacco? I shall skin them and cut off their heads, said Mrs. McGregor. Well, that doesn't sound good. Mrs. McGregor untied the sack and put her hand inside. When she felt the vegetables, she became very angry, and she said to Mr. McGregor, he thought he had done it on purpose. But Mr. McGregor was very angry too. One of the rotten marrows came flying through the window and hit the youngest Flopsy Bunny. It rather hurt. Then Benjamin and Flopsy thought it was time to go home. So Mr. McGregor did not get his tobacco. Mrs. McGregor did not get her skin coat. But next Christmas, Thomasina Tittlemouse, remember that mouse who cut the hole? Thomasina Tittlemouse got a present of enough rabbit wool to make herself a cloak. Because remember, they had all the little fur. And she had a cloak with a hood and a fancy muff and a pair of warm mittens. So that's the end of the story of the Flopsy Bunnies. But we still have Mrs. Tittlemouse. So Mrs. Tittlemouse, we're going to read about her. She's a very tidy housekeeper. So here's Mrs. Tittlemouse. This book was also by Beatrix Potter, and it was written in 1910. The other one was 1909, but this came next. So once upon a time, there was a wood mouse, and her name was Mrs. Tittlemouse, and she lived in a bank under a hedge. Such a funny house. There were yards and yards of sandy passage, lots of little holes, leading to storerooms and nut cellars and seed cellars, all among the roots of the hedge. There was a kitchen and a parlor and a pantry and a larder. Also, Mrs. Tittlemouse's bedroom, where she slept in a little tiny box bed. Mrs. Tittlemouse was a very tidy, particular little mouse, always sweeping and dusting the sandy floors. Sometimes a beetle lost its way in the passage. Shoo, 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 the little dirty feet, said Mrs. Tittlemouse, clattering with her dustpan. And one day, a little old woman ran up and down in a red spotted cloak. Well, this one happened to be a ladybug. Remember when we say, ladybug, ladybug, fly away home? Well, she said, your house is on fire, and your children will burn. Remember we all say that when we see a ladybug? So Mrs. Tittlemouse wants to get rid of the old lady with the ladybug. Another day, a big fat spider came into the shelter from the rain. Beg pardon, is this not Miss Muffet's? Go away, you bold spider, leaving ends of cobwebs all over my clean and tidy house. She bundled the spider out of the window. He let himself down in the hedge with a long, you know how to make a spider web, long, thin string? Well, that's how he left. Mrs. Tittlemouse went on her way to a distant storeroom to fetch cherry stones and thistledown for dinner. All along the passage she sniffed and looked at the floor. I smell honey. Is it the cowslips outside of the hedge? I'm sure I can see the marks of little dirty feet she could see in her house. She was such a clean housekeeper. Suddenly, around a corner, she met Babbity Bumble. Zzz, 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 said the bumblebee. Mrs. Tittlemouse looked at her severely. She wished she had a broom. Good day, Babbity Bumble. I should be glad to buy some beeswax. What are you doing down here in my house? Why do you always come in a window and say, bzz, 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 bzz? Mrs. Tittlemouse got quite cross at the bumblebee. Zzz, 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 replied Babbity Bumble in a peevish squeak. She sidled down a passage and disappeared into a storeroom which had been used for acorns. Mrs. Tittlemouse had eaten the acorns before Christmas. The storeroom ought to have been empty, but it was full of untidy moss. Mrs. Tittlemouse began to pull out the moss. 3 or 4 other bees put their heads out and buzzed fiercely. Well, they had made a nest in the storeroom with the moss. I am not in the habit of letting lodgings. This is an intrusion, she said. I will have them turned out. Buzz, 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 buzz. I wonder who would help me. Buzz, 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 whiz, buzz. I will not have Mr. Jackson. He never wipes his feet. Now, you'll meet Mr. Jackson in a minute. Mrs. Tittlemouse decided to leave the bees until after dinner. When she got back to the parlor, she heard someone coughing in a fat voice. And there sat Mr. Jackson himself. And he is a big bullfrog. He was in her nest. He was sitting over by a small rocking chair. Now, she's a little tiny mouse, so you can imagine her chair was little. And this huge bullfrog was sitting in her chair. He was sitting all over the small rocking chair, twiddling his thumbs and smiling. And he had his feet on the fender in front of the fireplace. He lived in a drain down below the hedge, in a very dirty, wet ditch. Well, he's a bullfrog. How do you do, Mr. Jackson? Dearie me, you've got very wet. You know, in her tidy house, this wet frog she was not happy. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Miss Tittlemouse. I'll sit a while and dry myself, said Mr. Jackson. He sat and smiled, and the water dripped off his coattails. Mrs. Tittlemouse went with a mop. He sat for a while, but he had to be asked if he would like to take some dinner. He's so there so long that she was ready for dinner, so she had to ask him for dinner. First, she offered him some cherry stones. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Miss Tittlemouse. I have no teeth, no teeth, no teeth, said Mr. Jackson. He opened his mouth very wide. He certainly had not a tooth in his head. Okay. Then she offered him thistledown seed. Tiddly widdly widdly, poof, 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 said Mr. Jackson. He blew the thistledown all over the room. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse. Now what I really, really like would be a little dish of honey. Remember, Mr. Winnie the Pooh liked honey. I am afraid I have not got any, Mr. Jackson, said Mrs. Tittlemouse. Tiddly widdly widdly, said Mrs. Tittlemouse, said the smiling Mr. Jackson. I can smell it. That's why I came to call. Mr. Jackson rose ponderously from the table, because he is a big fat frog, and began to look in the cupboards. Mrs. Tittlemouse followed him with a dishcloth to wipe up, because he'd left all these wet footprints all over her parlor floor. When he had convinced himself there was no honey in the cupboard, he began to walk down the passage. Indeed, indeed, you will stick fast, Mr. Jackson. Tiddly widdly widdly, he said to Mrs. Tittlemouse. First he squeezed into the pantry. Tiddly widdly widdly, no honey, Mrs. Tittlemouse. There were 3 creepy crawly people hiding in the plate rack. 2 of them got away, but the smallest little one got caught. There's some bugs. You know how you have bugs in the parlor when they have things? Then he squeezed into the larder. Mrs. Butterfly was tasting the sugar, but she flew away out the window. Tiddly widdly widdly, Mrs. Tittlemouse, you seem to have plenty of visitors. And without any invitation, Mrs. Tittlemouse said. They went along the sandy passage. Tiddly widdly widdly, buzz, buzz, buzz. He met Babbity around a corner and snapped her up and put her down again. I do not like bumblebees. They are all over bristles, said Mr. Jackson, wiping his mouth with his coat sleeve. Get out, you nasty old toad, shrieked Babbity Bumble. I shall go distracted, scolded Mrs. Tittymouse. She shut herself in the nut cellar while Mr. Jackson pulled out the bee's nest. He seemed to have no problem with the stings. When Mrs. Tittlemouse ventured to come out, everybody had gone away. But the untidiness was something dreadful. Never did I see such a mess. Smears of honey and moss and thistledown and marks of big and little dirty feet all over my nice clean house. She gathered up the moss and remains of the beeswax. Then she went out and fetched some twigs to partly close her front door. I will make it too small for Mr. Jackson. She fetched some soft soap and flannel and a new scrubbing brush for the storeroom. She was too tired to do any more. First she fell asleep in her chair, and then she went to bed. Will it ever be tidy again, said Mrs. Tittlemouse. Next morning she got up very early and began spring cleaning, which lasted a fortnight. Now that's 2 weeks. She swept and scrubbed and dusted. She rubbed up the furniture with beeswax and polished her little tin spoons. When it was all beautiful, neat, and clean, she gave a party to 5 other little mice without Mr. Jackson. He smelled the party and he came up the bank, but he could not squeeze in the door. So they handed him out acorn cups of honeydew through the window, and he was not at all offended. He sat outside in the sun and said, Tiddly widdly widdly, you're very good health, Mrs. Tittlemouse. That's the story of Mrs. Tittlemouse. Thank you very much. Give it a share and tell us that you love us.